Today we are going to be talking about different modes of inheritance and how to draw and interpret pedigrees. First of all, what is a pedigree? A pedigree is a chart of an individual's ancestors used in human genetics to analyze inheritance of certain traits. A circle stands for a female and a square is a male. If the circle or square is colored in, it signifies that that individual is affected by the particular trait we are looking at. If it is half colored, it means that they are a carrier. We are going to talk about 4 different modes of inheritance that are commonly seen on a pedigree. And additionally, we are going to touch on mitochondrial inheritance and multifactorial inheritance.
First, we will be looking at autosomal dominant traits. Autosomal dominant describes a condition in which individuals with the disease have one affected parent and one unaffected parent. Every generation has affected members, both males and females, who are affected at the same rate. You can't inherit the disease from an unaffected parent. A parent with an autosomal dominant disease has a 50% chance of passing that along to their children. Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant disease characterized by a progressive brain disorder that causes uncontrolled movements, emotional problems, and loss of the ability to think. The tree begins with a couple, in this case the grandparents. The grandfather was affected by Huntington's disease, the grandmother was not. The couple went on to have 4 kids. 2 of their kids, 1 girl and 1 boy, were each affected by the disease as well, while the other 2 children were not. Both the daughters started families of their own. The affected female had 3 children. 2 were affected and 1 was not. The unaffected female had no affected children.
A recessive gene means that although the individual does not show the characteristics for the gene, he or she still have the recessive gene in the DNA. In order for a recessive gene to be passed on to a child, the affected child must inherit one recessive gene from each parent. There's a 25% chance that the child born with 2 normal genes, a 50% chance that the child is born with 1 normal gene and 1 abnormal gene, and a 25% chance that the child is born with 2 abnormal genes. Cystic fibrosis is an autosomal recessive disease that is life-threatening, genetic, and causes persistent lung infections and progressively limits the ability to breathe. In this pedigree, we will start with the first generation, 1 male and 1 female, the grandparents. Since their shapes are not shaded in, neither of the grandparents are affected by the cystic fibrosis, the recessive gene disorder. However, 3 of their 5 offspring have cystic fibrosis. Therefore, the 3 affected children have the recessive gene for cystic fibrosis from each of their parents. One of the affected sons gets married and has 2 children. Neither of his children are affected by the recessive gene condition because their mother does not possess or does not pass along the gene for cystic fibrosis.
Let's go through a quick review of what X-linked means. Girls have 2 X chromosomes. Boys have 1 X chromosome and 1 Y chromosome. For any gene on the X chromosome, girls have 2 copies and boys have 1 copy. If a girl has a mutation on one of their X chromosomes, their other X chromosome will make up for the mutation and will most likely not show the effects of the mutation. If a boy has a gene with a mutation change on a single X chromosome, he does not have another copy of that gene to compensate for the changed gene, and this can cause a genetic disorder. Therefore, with X-linked diseases, the girl is usually just a healthier carrier, and the boy is affected.
Now let's take a look at X-linked recessive.
Duchenne muscular dystrophy is an X-linked recessive inherited disorder of progressive muscular weakness, typically in boys.
Let's figure out this example pedigree. Starting from the top, the mom is affected and the father is unaffected. The sons, number 5 and 7, are affected because there's an X-linked disease. With X-linked recessive diseases, if you have an affected mother, all of her sons will be affected. Now we must figure out the genotype for number 4, 6, 10, and 12. Number 4 is a carrier because to have a son with the disease, the mother needs to be a carrier. So let's color half of that circle in. Number 6 is a carrier as well because the mom is a carrier. So we'll color in half of that circle too. Number 10 and 12 could be either genotype. We won't know until they have sons. Now the pedigree's full.
X-linked dominant inheritance is a mode of genetic inheritance by which a dominant gene is carried on the X chromosome. By looking at a pedigree, we can determine if a specific trait is X-linked dominant. Now let's take a look. Fragile X syndrome is an X-linked dominant condition that causes a range of developmental problems, including learning disabilities and cognitive impairment. Usually males are more severely affected by this disorder than females. Fragile X syndrome occurs in approximately 1 in 4,000 males and 1 in 8,000 females and is inherited in an X-linked dominant pattern. First, we must determine if the trait is dominant or recessive. By looking at the pedigree, the first question we must ask ourselves is, do all affected individuals have an affected parent? Yes, this means that the trait will be dominant. Now we can figure out if it is X-linked or autosomal. Next, we ask ourselves, do all affected males have an affected mother? The answer is yes. All affected males will have an affected mother due to the mother having 2 X chromosomes. Do all affected fathers have an affected daughter? Yes, again. The father only has 1 chromosome, so if the dad has a daughter, he's going to pass on the X chromosome no matter what. No affected fathers will have an affected sons. Therefore, the trait we are looking at is in fact X-linked dominant.
Now we'll look at mitochondrial inheritance. Diabetes mellitus is a form of mitochondrial inheritance that results in too much sugar in the blood and can put the individual at risk for convulsions or a coma. Mitochondrial inheritance is the transmission of the mitochondrial genome from mother to child. Mitochondria have their own set of genes, which are largely involved in the metabolic process. They are inherited only in the maternal ova and not in the sperm. It affects males and females, but is only maternally inherited. An affected male cannot pass on his mitochondria to his children. Alterations to this mitochondrial DNA can cause several disorders, which are often associated with neuromuscular features.
Lastly, we will touch on multifactorial inheritance. Spina bifida is a birth defect in which a developing baby's spinal cord fails to develop properly, often causing paralysis of the lower limbs and even mental handicap. Many factors, hence multifactorial, are involved in causing the birth defect. Factors are both genetic and environmental, meaning that the genes from the parents and environmental factors produce the condition.